In the quiet corners of history lie stories seldom told, forged by human resilience and failure alike. And this is one such tale. The chapter we share now traverses the river of time, revealing moments that changed the world. Let us embark on a journey back to a past long forgotten, yet whose echoes still resonate today. What strength must a land sealed off by desert and glacier possess to rise again and again from the brink of destruction? Chile stands among Earth's most isolated nations. Its people have always coexisted with extremes. This land is both a barrier and a crucible, forging a nation through struggle. For centuries, pioneers and conquerors, rebels and dreamers have converged here. Meeting the land itself, their history trembles like earthquakes shaking the crust. We witness the hunters of Monte Verde, the campaigns of Mapuche warriors, the struggles for freedom, and the reigns of authoritarian rule. Each era paints a portrait of a nation clinging to survival amidst despair, yet every fall brings rebirth, every loss renewal. From the first migrants 12,000 years ago to the flames of modern protest, Chile's story remains a cycle of conflict and rebirth. Approximately 10,000 years ago, the first tribe set foot on this land called Chile. They carried the legacy of their ancient ancestors' great migration from Asia. Hunting clans and tribes continually mastered new survival skills during their southern journey. Upon reaching the continent's southernmost tip, they discovered this largely unknown land. Vast arid deserts, dense frigid forest towering mountains, and the Patagonian icefields. Survival demanded resilience and ingenuity. This land still bears the imprints of early human ingenuity. Artifacts unearthed at the Monte Verde site dating back 14,500 years. This discovery overturned scholars' understanding of human origins in the Americas. Previously, most scholars believed human migration occurred much later. Yet the stone tools, animal bones, and ancient footprints found here reveal that humans had established organized communities in prehistoric times. Remains of wooden huts and traces of plant gathering indicate they were not nomads, but instead established seasonal camps based on terrain and climate. Monte Verde stands as a milestone rewriting the opening chapter of the Americas' history. The daily lives of these early inhabitants revolved around hunting and gathering. Initially, they hunted mammoths, giant ground sloths, and other megafauna. These beasts provided meat hides for shelter and bones for tools. When climate shifts and overhunting led to the disappearance of large animals, people turned to smaller game fish and wild plants. This compelled them to invent new tools and explore fresh ways of survival. Different regions of Chile demanded locally adapted strategies. They sought water in the Atacama Desert, fished along the endless coastline, or stored food in the humid southern forests. This land profoundly shaped local cultures. Northern tribes inhabited the driest place on Earth. Despite scarce water, they learned to survive alongside small rivers and seasonal rains. Due to exceptionally dry air, traces of their camps and tool remains are still clearly preserved in the sand. Further south, fertile river valleys between the Andes and the ocean enabled a lifestyle blending hunting with early agriculture. The southern forests present harsher conditions. Dense vegetation, prolonged rainy seasons, and bitter winters yet offer abundant gifts, fish, shellfish, and medicinal plants. Their ingenuity is evident in their tools. Stone points grew increasingly refined for hunting small game. They fashioned fishing gear from bone and wood, drawing sustenance from the sea caves scattered across the landscape, preserved murals and carvings. These marks reveal that even in hardship, people yearn to document and share their existence. Ironically, scientists now use the Atacama Desert as a testing ground for Mars rovers, due to its extreme aridity and barrenness. It is precisely this aridity that preserved the oldest traces of life in the Americas, allowing scholars to piece together the life of Chile's indigenous peoples. Their world was one of challenges and opportunities. These discoveries laid the foundation for the indigenous cultures that later emerged. Before the arrival of Europeans, Chile was home to numerous indigenous societies. The arid north was the homeland of the Atacamenos. They built towns on this harshest land on earth. To survive, they dug canals to channel scarce seasonal river water to their fields. Corn, quinoa and potatoes grew in terraced plots within narrow valleys. These harvests not only fed families but sustained entire towns. Their masterful pottery and textiles showcase craftsmanship beyond mere survival. Though the desert appears barren, the Atacamenos have built enduring vitality through organisation, water conservation and trade. The central valleys and forested regions extending southward are the domain of the Mapuche. Unlike the agricultural peoples of the north, the Mapuche are both cultivators and warriors. They plant corn and beans on fertile lands. Their social life is built upon family and clan bonds. Crucially, they possess a deep tradition of warfare and defence. Leaders often emerge from the ranks of elite warriors. This reverence for freedom would shape centuries of resistance against outsiders. The Mapuche excelled both in agriculture and in preparing for war. Their villages, known as rucas, were not isolated settlements, but components of a vast confederation capable of rapid mobilization in times of crisis. In the far south, human existence took on another form. In Patagonia, Tierra del Fuego and the tempest-tossed straits nomadic groups like the Chononcauescar and Yaghan dwell. These maritime peoples navigate frigid waters in canoes crafted from bark-covered planks. Wrapped in animal hides against wind and rain, they traverse islands subsisting on fish shellfish and marine mammals. Their fire never dies, not even aboard their vessels. Thus they are known as the canoe people. Their entire world is defined by the waters they navigate. Their understanding of tides, currents and storms stems from centuries of experience. In lands unsuitable for farming, survival means migration and a profound knowledge of the sea. By the late 15th century, a new force invaded northern Chile, the Inca Empire. Expanding southward from Cuzco, the Incas incorporated the Atacama region and central Chile into their domain. Their power manifested in road construction. The renowned Inca road system, Capacnan, traversed mountains and deserts extending into Chilean valleys. Along the route, tambos, way stations, provided lodging for messengers and officials. This formed a transportation network stretching from Ecuador to the Maipo Valley. Messengers could transmit information using knotted records, quipus, traversing thousands of miles in an instant. It was like an ancient internet intelligence flowed through a network of messengers, supply stations and fortresses. Yet even the mighty Inca Empire encountered resistance in the south. The Mapuche people fiercely resisted conquest, holding back armies that had subjugated countless nations. Repeated attempts at conquest ultimately reached a stalemate. The Inca frontier advanced only as far as the Mole River, before encountering fierce resistance that could not be breached. This dividing line not only demarcated territories but also marked ethnic identity. Surrounded by the largest empire in the hemisphere, this free people maintained their independence. Thus, when the Spanish arrived, Chile's multicultural system remained intact. Desert irrigators, plains, farmers, glacier warriors and seafaring clans each mastered wisdom and skills perfectly attuned to their respective lands. In 1535, mere years after the Inca Empire's collapse, Spanish eyes turned to the southern lands they called Chile. Diego de Almagro, ally of Francisco Pizarro, assembled a force departing from Cuzco. He yearned to discover another kingdom rich in precious metals. Spain's expansionist ambitions in the Americas were fueled by the riches of Mexico and Peru. Rulers were convinced that beyond the mountains lay even greater treasures. Almagro's expedition included hundreds of Spaniards' indigenous allies from other regions and enslaved labourers. This vast force reflected not only his grand ambitions, but also his determination to conquer a new empire. The southern campaign was brutal. crossing the Andes, the high-altitude cold was bone-chilling. Snow famine and thin air exhausted both men and beasts. Many horses collapsed on frozen trails while marching soldiers suffered frostbite and starvation. Upon reaching the Atacama Desert, new trials followed. Water was scarce, vegetation sparse, and the arid air made every step a struggle. Livestock perished from thirst while soldiers rationed their meagre provisions. Historians record that many never completed the journey. The expedition suffered heavy casualties before reaching the southern valleys entering central Chile. Almagro's men anticipated cities of gold and silver. Reality proved starkly different. The indigenous settlements they discovered were mostly farming communities dotted with corn and bean fields. The absence of a centralized government meant no treasures to plunder. Fertile lands and rivers nourishing villages lay before them, yet held no meaning for the impatient Spaniards. Almagro found no riches comparable to those of Peru. With supplies exhausted, he ordered a retreat. The journey north proved as deadly as the march south, claiming more lives and spreading despair. Though devoid of riches, the expedition left an indelible mark. Soldiers carried back tales of temperate valleys and rivers in central Chile, a stark contrast to the harsh desert. These reports painted a land suitable for cultivation and settlement. For bold conquerors who looked beyond immediate wealth, it signalled the potential for stable colonies. Though Almagro abandoned the expedition, the message he conveyed ensured Chile's place in history. One detail from the first expedition stands out. Marching alongside the Spaniards were indigenous slaves from other regions and Africans who'd crossed the Atlantic. This meant that during Almagro's journey, the first Africans set foot on Chilean soil. Thus began the long and complex chapter of Africans in South America. Ultimately, Almagro's expedition revealed both Chile's perils and its potential. The absence of gold ended fleeting dreams, yet the vision of fertile lands endured. This would profoundly shape the future, when Pedro de Valdivia set out to establish a permanent Spanish foothold. In 1540, Pedro de Valdivia departed Peru with soldiers, indigenous auxiliaries and slaves, determined to succeed where Almagro had failed. His goal was no longer fleeting riches, but the establishment of a lasting colony. Among the conquistadors, Valdivia's vision was rare. He sought not gold, but land where Spanish influence could take root. After months of arduous travel, the expedition reached Chile's fertile central valleys. They chose a site at the foot of a rocky hill named Huelen, later renamed San Lucia. In February 1541, the city of Santiago was born. This Spanish town was meticulously planned, a central plaza, government buildings, immigrant settlements. Yet Santiago's foundations were unstable from the start. Unlike Peru or Mexico, it yielded no tribute revenues nor central resources to draw upon. The vast territory was scattered with indigenous tribes who owed no allegiance to the Spanish newcomers. Valdivia attempted to distribute land and labour through the encomienda system, but resistance surged rapidly. The Mapuche emerged as the primary force opposing Spanish expansion. Their warlike traditions and spirit of freedom endowed them with the will and capacity to resist foreign rule. This resistance was not sporadic skirmishing, but erupted into an organised uprising aimed at expelling the newcomers. Within mere months of Santiago's founding, Spanish hopes revealed their fragility. A massive indigenous army led by Michimalonco launched a devastating assault on the colony. The attack reduced the town to ashes, leaving little but ruins. For the Spaniards, this moment could have ended their entire endeavour. Santiago teetered on the brink of annihilation in its first year. Yet the town did not fall completely. Its defenders fought with desperate resolve, knowing their survival was tied to the colony's very existence. Inés Suárez emerged as pivotal to this defence. One of the few Spanish women on the expedition, historians record her role as crucial yet brutal. In the crisis, she reportedly executed prisoners within the settlement herself, displaying severed heads to intimidate the attackers. This feat became an early colonial legend remembered for its brutality and its effect on morale. Regardless of the accuracy of the details, her presence signified the extreme circumstances facing the settlement. Santiago's survival stemmed not from wealth or abundance, but from the sheer will of a small group unwilling to relinquish their fragile foothold. Over the following decades, the Spanish gradually consolidated their foothold in central Chile. Yet this frontier society remained under constant strain. Farms and herds replaced Santiago's ruins. Beyond these precarious borders, however, waves of resistance continued to surge. The Mapuche in particular waged frequent campaigns raiding settlements and destroying outposts, plunging the southern frontier into perpetual warfare. Spanish rulers sought to consolidate control, yet their authority remained constrained by the practical limits of governance across this rugged terrain. By the late 16th century, while Spain controlled central Chile, its southern border was defined by conflict rather than conquest. Colonial survival meant struggling against tenacious indigenous resistance, a constant reminder that Spanish rule was never truly complete. By the 17th century, Chile had transitioned from its initial savage warfare to a relatively stable colonial state, yet it remained barren compared to other Spanish territories. The mineral wealth that made Mexico and Peru pillars of the empire eluded Chile. Its economic foundation was rooted in the land, with agriculture and livestock forming the cornerstone of colonial life. Large estates around Santiago and in the central valleys extensively cultivated, wheat produced wine and raised livestock. These goods were transported north to Peru to sustain the ongoing operations of the Potosi silver mines. Its economic foundation was rooted in the land with agriculture and livestock, forming the cornerstone of colonial life farms in the Santiago area and central valleys extensively cultivated wheat, produced wine and raised livestock. These goods were transported north to Peru, providing sustained supplies for thousands of miners and their families at the Potosi silver mines. In this role, Chile's value lay not in producing precious metals, but in serving as the empire's distant granary. Spanish colonists in the Central Valley established large estates, haciendas, which became centres of agricultural production. Wheat processed in small-town mills was transported by mule trains along trade routes linking Chilean and Peruvian markets. Vineyards flourished in the fertile river valleys. Chilean wines gradually rivaled Spanish imports in colonial markets, showcasing the region's early winemaking expertise. Livestock herds grazed vast pastures with leather and tallow, becoming vital trade goods. With urban industry scarce, these rural estates shaped economic life, giving rise to a small elite class of landowners. Even as the central regions fell under control, the south remained engulfed in conflict. The Mapuche people remained unconquered, persistently resisting Spanish expansion. For over a century, shifting frontiers severed Spanish territories from Mapuche strongholds. Fortresses were built along the Bio River and beyond, garrisoned by colonial soldiers who repeatedly faced uprisings, raids, and attacks. Every Spanish attempt to penetrate deeper into Mapuche territory ignited fresh warfare. While most indigenous centres on the continent fell under Spanish rule, the southern regions maintained their unconquered freedom. Chilean colonial society was built upon an order similar to that of Spain proper. At the apex stood the Spanish elite and their descendants who held land and political power. Below them were the mestizos, a growing mixed-race population primarily engaged in labour crafts, and military service indigenous communities were incorporated into a labour system, linked to the encomienda forced to work the fields and estates. A small population of African slaves formed another social stratum existing within domestic workshops and rural estates. Though far fewer in number than in Brazil and elsewhere, Africans formed distinct communities in Chile. enriching the local labour force and culture in often overlooked ways. The Catholic Church expanded its influence throughout the century. Missionaries penetrated indigenous territories to promote conversion, while religious orders operated schools cultivating local elites. Churches sprang up in towns and villages, serving as centres of faith and symbols of Spanish rule. The church became a major landowner, shaping local governance through its influence on education and the legal system. Natural upheavals and maritime threats profoundly impacted Chilean life. Frequent earthquakes destroyed towns, wiping out years of effort and reminding settlers of their homeland's fragility. Tsunamis struck coastal communities, while pirate raids disrupted trade, forcing rulers to maintain costly defence systems. In 1647, Santiago suffered devastating destruction when a powerful earthquake reduced most of the city to ruins, claiming the lives of approximately one-third of its inhabitants. Despite concerns that the original site was too dangerous, Santiago was rebuilt in the same location, reflecting both an attachment to the valley and the resilience of its people. Throughout the 17th century, Chile's survival depended not on wealth, but on tenacity. Though perpetually a marginal colony on the empire's periphery, its agricultural lifeline rendered it indispensable to the Spanish world. By the 18th century, Chile presented a society both stable and unsettled within the Spanish Empire. The fertile valleys surrounding Santiago and Concepcion ensured steady agricultural yields, while central colonial towns functioned much like their Spanish counterparts. Churches dotted the landscape, markets bustled, and municipal councils operated. Yet the frontier stretching southward, bordering Mapuche territory, remained perpetually turbulent. No other region in Spanish America resisted imperial expansion with such tenacious defiance. Beyond the Bio River, the Mapuche shaped centuries of history through a complex interplay of raids, battles, and negotiations. Chile was not a land of gold or silver, its borders were constantly shifting. Where Spanish power ended, indigenous freedom began. At the heart of this lay the protracted conflict known as the Arauco War. This was not a battle with a clear endpoint, but a conflict spanning generations. Spanish soldiers built fortresses along the frontier, attempting to control pastures and roads, yet these outposts were perpetually under attack. Mapuche warriors launched swift raids before vanishing into the forests that fueled their speed. Frontier settlers lived in constant fear of plunder, losing crops and livestock. Entire towns often lay deserted amid waves of unrest. For the colonial government, the South became a bottomless pit. Military and resource investments rarely yielded lasting victories. Chile diverged from many colonies in Spain's ultimate response rather than pursuing total conquest. The colonial rulers turned to parliamentary mechanisms, formal peace negotiations between the Spanish governor and Mapuche chieftains. These assemblies resembled diplomatic ceremonies accompanied by feasts, speeches, and gifts. Through negotiation, a map of spheres of influence was drawn. The Spanish acknowledged the impossibility of lasting control south of the Bio River. This represented a rare concession within the Spanish world, acknowledging Mapuche autonomy. While these meetings temporarily eased overt conflict, they failed to eliminate violence entirely. As the southern frontier shaped military and political dynamics, central Chile developed an agriculture-centered society. Large estates known as haciendas proliferated. Controlled by a handful of powerful families, their influence permeated political, ecclesiastical, and municipal institutions. On this land, indigenous labourers, mestizos and slaves cultivated wheat, livestock and grapes that sustained the colonial economy. With no exportable mineral resources, agriculture and livestock became the foundation of daily life. While land ownership served as the primary symbol of social status, the Mapuche did not cling rigidly to old ways. They integrated European tools, horses and iron weapons into their culture of resistance. Horses particularly transformed their military role. By the 18th century, Mapuche cavalry were renowned for their swift tactics, often outmanoeuvring and outfighting colonial horsemen. Iron-tipped lances seized or traded from the Spanish granted them another advantage. These transformations meant that, after centuries of conflict, the Mapuche were not a conquered people. Instead, they reshaped and strengthened their society by selectively adopting foreign elements. Thus, as the 19th century dawned, Chile remained a frontier colony. Its identity was intertwined with wheat fields and vineyards, yet also entangled with the unresolved struggle against indigenous peoples in the south. The pulse of history echoed with cries of resistance and a shared sense of unease. 1808 brought seismic shifts in Europe's power structure. Napoleon's invasion of Spain forced Ferdinand VII into exile. The Spanish monarchy, which had ruled the vast American territories for centuries, suddenly appeared weakened. Sovereignty shifted to French power in Europe, while exiled groups loyal to Spain rose to assert their rights. This triggered a crisis in the Spanish colonies, who held true authority. Was it the French-backed king, the imprisoned Ferdinand, or the representatives from mainland Spain? This uncertainty reverberated across Latin America, opening a window for local leaders to question the necessity of Spanish rule. In Chile, the primary voices came from the Creole elite. Those born locally to Spanish parents, long subjected to governance by European-appointed officials. Though possessing wealth and influence, these individuals were often excluded from the highest government positions, posts perpetually reserved for Spaniards from the Iberian Peninsula. With Madrid's fall and the monarchy's collapse, Creoles began exploring autonomy. Initially, their rhetoric was cautious. Most professed loyalty to Ferdinand, the legitimate king, advocating autonomy only until his return. This balancing act reflected the era's uncertainty. Moderates sought to preserve their privileges while fearing accusations of outright rebellion. The momentum grew rapidly. Debate in Santiago's municipal council cut to the core: did loyalty to Spain mean obedience to French miners-backed officials? On September 18, 1810, leaders convened a public assembly and proclaimed the nation's first government, the United Committee. This local governing body, established in the name of King Ferdinand, was not a declaration of independence, yet posterity would commemorate this day as Chile's symbolic birth as a nation. The United Committee assumed political authority, organized local militias, and prepared for new elections. The center of power abruptly shifted from Madrid to Santiago, yet this fledgling autonomous regime exposed Chile's deep societal fractures. Moderates favored gradual reform, still viewing Spain as a protective framework. They advocated temporary allegiance, believing slow change would follow Europe's crisis resolution. Radicals, however, saw this as the moment for full independence. For them, breaking with Spain heralded Chile's inevitable future beyond foreign control. In the years that followed, these opposing stances ignited fierce internal struggles within the fledgling government, with each side accusing the other of endangering national stability. A revitalized Spain responded swiftly. Royal officials stationed in Chilean loyalist factions began reversing the autonomy process. Sporadic clashes erupted between the royal army and patriotic militias formed by the military commission. Though not yet a full minor-scale revolutionary war, these early clashes demonstrated that the struggle for autonomy had moved beyond mere theoretical debate. It would inevitably evolve into armed confrontation. José Miguel Carrera emerged as the pivotal figure of this era. This young, charismatic leader assumed power in 1811 and leveraged his position to accelerate Chile's march toward independence. Under his guidance, symbols of national identity began to emerge. In 1812, he designed Chile's first national flag, distinct from Spain's bella. New symbols and documents conveyed patriotic messages, signaling the formation of an independent Chilean identity. Notably, this era saw the creation of Chile's first national anthem, celebrating the spirit of independence. Though uncommon, Chile did not permanently adopt its first anthem. Decades later, the current version replaced the original, reflecting early shifts in identity within this turbulent nation. In 1814, Chile's fragile independence movement suffered a devastating blow. Though patriotic forces organized defenses against Spanish troops, they were ultimately crushed at the Battle of Rancagua. Royalist forces besieged the town, where Bernardo O'Higgins' patriotic fighters mounted a desperate counterattack. Outnumbered and surrounded, the Patriots fought until their ammunition and provisions were exhausted. As the defenses teetered on collapse, chaos swept through the ranks. Defeat forced leaders like O'Higgins to retreat north, but danger did not end in Chile. They were compelled to cross the Andes Mountains, seeking refuge in Argentina alongside other exiled revolutionaries. With the fall of Rancagua, the independence movement collapsed, and the land returned to Spanish rule. The ensuing years became known as the Reconquest. As royalist leaders reclaimed firm control over Chile, repression became routine policy. Known revolutionaries faced execution or exile, their property was confiscated, and community activities came under strict surveillance. Royalist officials worked to erase traces of the early movement, enforcing a harsh censorship regime to restore colonial order. Towns that had supported patriotic leaders faced punishment. Many accused of aiding rebels were imprisoned or sentenced to hard labor. For civilians, the recuperation era brought crisis, a colonial atmosphere of suspicion and fear where any association with the independence cause could lead to ruin. Yet exile across the Andes not only offered refuge to patriots but also created an opportunity to regroup. The struggle for independence in mainland Argentina had already commenced. Mendoza became the strategic hub for two great leaders, José de San Martin, a military genius from the Rio de la Plata basin, and Bernardo O'Higgins, the Chilean leader who narrowly escaped death at the Battle of Rancagua. They transcended the narrow vision of the Chilean uprising, setting their sights on the liberation journey of the entire South American continent. Thus was born the Army of the Andes, this elite force, rigorously trained and supplied, vowed to breach the mountain barrier and liberate Chile. The plan demanded one of the boldest military operations in the history of the Americas. In early 1817, thousands of soldiers began crossing the Andes. The mountains soared over 20,000 feet, where biting winds, thin air, and snow minus blocked trails tested their resolve. Soldiers carried equipment and supplies along narrow mountain paths, driving pack animals laden with artillery across frozen rails. Desertion and the risk of freezing to death were ever minus present threats. Yet the army pressed forward with unwavering resolve. Historians often compare this feat to Hannibal's crossing of the Alps or Napoleon's military campaigns in Europe. For South America, the Andes crossing campaign matched these legendary journeys in scale and outcome, becoming a pivotal turning point in history. When the Army of the Andes finally entered Chilean territory, its arrival completely altered the balance of power. In February 1817, San Martin and O'Higgins confronted the royalist forces at the Battle of Chacabuco. The Patriots achieved a decisive victory, not only securing the route to Santiago, but also revitalizing the independence movement that had seemed crushed 3 years prior. O'Higgins assumed supreme command, leveraging the new-found strength of military triumph and political authority to steer the revolution. The Spanish attempted to re-establish control, but the final showdown erupted at the Battle of Mapuche in April 1818. Here the Patriots utterly crushed the royalist forces. The royalist army disintegrated, dashing Spain's hopes of reclaiming its colony. From that moment, Chile ceased to be a land of rebellion and became an independent republic. A detail from the Andes campaign vividly illustrates the intertwining of warfare and ideology. Amidst the heavy supplies carried over the mountains lay a portable printing press. The patriots used it to print leaflets and proclamations, spreading revolutionary ideas among local populations as they advanced. This early form of noble propaganda signaled that the struggle was not merely a war of arms, but also a war of ideas, both essential pillars for securing Chile's future. Though the 1818 Battle of Mapuche secured independence on paper, the new republic soon discovered that crucial royalist strongholds remained entrenched in the south and along the Pacific coast. Spanish forces in these regions continued to pose a grave threat, fortified garrisons poised for counterattack at any moment. The southern strongholds and ports stubbornly remained loyal to the crown, their existence undermining Chile's legitimacy in pursuing complete freedom. Ensuring survival meant extending the conflict from the central valleys to the oceans and remote coastlines. The navy thus became a crucial force. The government sought assistance from British officer Lord Thomas Cochrane, renowned in Europe for his daring military exploits and relentless reforms. Upon Cochrane's arrival, the Chilean fleet was minuscule and poorly equipped, scarcely capable of challenging the formidable royalist fleet guarding southern Peru and Chile. He set about forging a disciplined naval force. He trained sailors in modern tactics, refurbished ships, using every available domestic resource, and forged the fleet's reputation for valor. These initiatives freed Chile from coastal defense constraints, empowering it to challenge Spanish maritime dominance in the Pacific. The new navy's prowess reached its zenith in 1820. Valdivia, one of Spain's strongest strongholds in the Americas, sat on Chile's southern coast. Its port and fortifications made it nearly impregnable to conventional assault. Cochrane assembled a small force for a surprise landing. Under cover of night, they seized the royalist outpost and captured the remaining positions one by one in a lightning campaign. Within days, Valdivia's city fell. This victory not only destroyed one of Spain's last major strongholds, but also placed a strategic port under the control of the fledgling republic. The fall of Valdivia held profound significance. It proved that with tenacity and ingenious strategy, even Spain's most impregnable fortresses could be breached. The scope of O'Higgins and Cochrane's struggle extended far beyond Chile. Both viewed liberation as a regional mission, planning expeditions into Peru, the heartland of Spain's remaining South American holdings. Between 1820 and 1821, Chilean fleets sailed north to transport troops, supporting José Diaz and Martin's campaign to capture Lima. Chilean crews blockaded ports, raided supplies, and disrupted communications, forcing Spain to spread its forces thin across vast territories. By pushing the front lines into Peru, Chile ensured the conflict would not backfire on its homeland. Despite these victories, one royalist stronghold stubbornly resisted. Chiloé Island, off the southern coast, held out until the late 1822. Its isolated geography and fortified defenses made it exceptionally difficult to conquer. Multiple attempts faltered due to logistical challenges in supplying troops. Only in 1826, through negotiations and military pressure, did the island's garrison finally surrender. This marked the official end of Spanish colonial rule across all of Chile. Following victory, the republic faced immense challenges. Years of conflict had left the economy exhausted. Political factions clashed over the new nation's direction, while the burdens of reconstruction and stability proved overwhelming even for the most capable leaders. Independence brought freedom, yet exposed divisions that would shape the political landscape for decades. An anecdote about Cochrane vividly illustrates the ingenuity of the war. To intimidate a larger royalist force, he disguised the lone ship as a warship, mounting painted wooden cannons on the deck and placing mannequins as soldiers. This tactic led the enemy to mistakenly believe they were facing a fleet and retreat in panic. Such a simple deception proved remarkably effective, highlighting how creativity often turned the tide during Chile's unification war. The years following Chile's liberation from Spanish rule were often peaceful. From 1826 to 1833, the fledgling republic was mired in persistent turmoil. After decades of conflict, leaders yearned for stability, yet the nation slid into a quagmire of weak government and shifting alliances. Few administrations lasted long, and governance rules changed like the tides. New constitutions were discarded months after enactment, and the rapid succession of regimes meant that before the people could adjust to one, another round of change was already upon them. The process that should have consolidated independence instead evolved into another struggle, this time not against Spain, but against Chileans themselves. At the heart of the turmoil lay the sharp confrontation between centralists and federalists. Centralists advocated for a powerful unified government, entered in Santiago to maintain fragile state institutions and ensure consistent policy implementation. Federalists championed the opposite ideal, pushing for local autonomy and provincial self-governance. This tug-of-war was not merely theoretical, it determined how power and tax revenues would be distributed in a nation defined by regional economies and local loyalty. Both sides feared the other's victory would destroy the republic, making compromise unlikely. Amid these conflicts, presidents often resigned early, were all stout, or were politically replaced. Ramon Freire, for instance, emerged as a pivotal military leader of the era. Military leaders were soldiers who combined political power with control over armed supporters. During the War of Independence, figures like the Carrera brothers demonstrated how strong personal leadership could defeat opponents. This pattern persisted after 1826. Though Freire controlled national politics, he failed to establish lasting unity, facing ongoing resistance from generals and regional powers. The military no longer obeyed civilian rule, but became a permanent force in regime change. Chile's fiscal crisis exacerbated this fragility. Years of warfare against Spain had depleted the treasury. The navy, crucial for capturing royalist strongholds, demanded exorbitant maintenance costs. Yet without it, Chile faced maritime exposure, expenses for troop pay, fortress upkeep, and war debts frequently outstripped economic capacity. Though the government borrowed to cover shortfalls, creditors swiftly lost faith in the faltering administration, regimes incapable of repaying debts or fulfilling promises. Economic weakness undermined political foundations. Strapped governments lost legitimacy and became more vulnerable to overthrow. Such anxieties ran so deep that leaders occasionally sought radical solutions. One plan even proposed installing a foreign monarch to impose order from above. A French prince was among the candidates, with preliminary negotiations underway, though never implemented. This very concept revealed the desperation of certain elites. They no longer trusted domestic institutions to deliver stability. Instead, they sought to borrow legitimacy from Europe, just as Spanish rule had done in the past. By 1833, the tentative republican experiment had run its course. Elites now argued that only a robust constitutional frameworks, entering authority to restrain warlords and guarantee order, could end the chaos. Chile subsequently shifted toward a more authoritarian governance model. This form of rule dominated the political landscape for decades, lifting the nation from its founding turmoil. The 1833 Constitution marked a turning point in Chilean political life. It aimed to end the turbulent decade of frequent regime changes. The new system concentrated power in the central government. The presidential system became the core institution. The office was granted broad authority, not only to execute laws but also to influence nearly all government departments. The president controlled the military and finances, and even held absolute authority over the appointment of judges and local officials. While an electoral system existed, participation was restricted to a select few. Areas like property qualifications and literacy tests disenfranchised the majority of citizens. In practice, democratic representation was severely limited, while executive power became immense. Despite its authoritarian overtones, this framework provided Chile with an element sorely lacking since independence: stability. Political elites, particularly conservatives, embraced the system, as it established a controllable, orderly state. The nation no longer fragmented every few years due to ideological clashes, allowing the conservative order to endure for decades. The figure most closely associated with this regime was Diego Portales. Though never president, he laid its foundations through sheer influence. Portales firmly believed national progress required strong authority and discipline as its bedrock. His assassination in 1837 did not diminish his influence. The political rules he championed continued to govern the political landscape after his death, and his ideas persistently guided his successors. President Manuel Bulnes and Manuel Montt were the very embodiment of the centralizing ideology of that era. During Bulnes' administration, Chile overcame internal divisions, strengthened its military, and firmly anchored governmental power in the capital. Montt implemented administrative reforms, wielding authority to further expand the nation's influence. Both figures benefited from the foundations laid by the 1833 Constitution, demonstrating the model's exceptional effectiveness in consolidating control. Their rule stood in stark contrast to the loose confederation that had plagued Chile during the 1822. Institutional development became the hallmark of this period. Chile's military evolved from fragmented forces of warlords and militias into a professionalized corps loyal to the central government. Bureaucracy steadily expanded, forming a civil service framework supporting the executive branch. The Catholic Church had secured a pivotal role in social life, establishing itself as a permanent partner to the government, not only in matters of faith, but also in education and moral oversight. Together, the military, bureaucracy, and church formed the backbone of the conservative order, providing the political elite with the stability they required. The broader economy also began to recover. Exports became the lifeline of the national finances. Wheat fields in the central valleys not only met domestic demand, but also generated an export surplus. During California's mid-19th century gold rush, miners across the Pacific purchased vast quantities of Chilean wheat, integrating the nation into a burgeoning trade network. Copper and silver also flowed steadily from Chilean ports, generating stable revenues for the ruling elite, bolstered by stable governance and profitable trade. Infrastructure gradually improved. Roads became increasingly accessible. Schools were established, and the capital's importance as the nation's administrative center grew. Yet these achievements were built upon exclusion. Press freedom was restricted. Dissent was suppressed. Critics of the regime faced exile or arrest. Chile's growing stability came at the cost of restricted political freedom. While the nation advanced economically and educationally, political life remained firmly controlled by a small ruling elite. By the mid-19th century, Chile had evolved into a relatively stable republic. Yet its rulers looked beyond consolidating power in Santiago and Valparaiso. The government sought to extend its authority into territories historically beyond colonial and state control. A period from the 1860s to the late 1870s was characterized by territorial expansion, military strengthening, and the annexation of lands long resistant to Spanish and early Republican influence. This expansion promised not only more farmland and resources, but also aimed to project state power into regions where central control had always been weak. The primary target was the southern frontier, vast territories where Mapuche tribes maintained their autonomy. For centuries, they had resisted Spanish conquest, forcing colonial rulers to recognize their independence through treaties. Yet as the Chilean state grew in power, this equilibrium was shattered. Beginning in the 1862, officials in Santiago launched what would become known as the occupation of Araucanesia. Armies steadily advanced into Mapuche territories, building fortifications, seizing land, and introducing new settlers. This process was slow and complex, intertwined with battles, raids, and negotiations, but its direction was clear. The state was determined to impose control, disregarding local resistance. Government leaders framed these actions as pacification, implying a civilizing mission. Yet the reality was far crueler. Mapuche families in fertile valleys were forcibly displaced, their contiguous lands fragmented for agricultural production and private enterprises. After losing their territories, numerous indigenous communities faced economic decline and increasing marginalization on their ancestral lands. Over time, settlers occupied Mapuche traditional territories, reshaping not only the southern economy, but also altering the local demographic balance. Beyond the military, settlers played a central role in this process. To repopulate the occupied land, the state vigorously promoted European immigration policies, offering incentives to families willing to relocate to the southern frontier. German immigrants were particularly numerous. They established towns, launched businesses, and introduced farming techniques adapted to the region's humid climate. Their influence extended beyond agriculture, weaving cultural traditions into Chilean life. Beer brewing stands as a lasting legacy. This craft took root here, ultimately giving rise to a nationwide beer culture. Meanwhile, Chile turned its gaze northward, though seemingly barren. The desert bordered Bolivia and Peru, regions soon revealing vast nitrate deposits. Before wars erupted over these resources, the Chilean government established borders through treaties. These agreements maintained a fragile peace, yet reflected Chile's growing sense of crisis, that its northern frontier would inevitably face contention. Strengthening territorial claims in the north became crucial, as consolidating lands seized from the Mapuche in the south. The military played a pivotal role in these endeavors. Years of military operations in Araucanesia honed the army's discipline and combat capabilities. Officers gained practical experience in border conflicts and expeditions across rugged terrain. This training forged the Chilean military, better preparing it for the major campaigns to come. Years later, this experience would prove pivotal when Chile's forces confronted its neighbors in the War of the Pacific, one of the 19th century's most significant conflicts. In 1879, Chile became embroiled in a war that would reshape the map of South America. Hostilities erupted over control of the Atacama Desert, a seemingly barren land rich in nitrate deposits. This vital natural compound, essential for fertilizers and explosives, had become one of the world's most prized resources. Bolivia controlled most of the territory, while Peru maintained interest through local companies. When Bolivia attempted to increase taxes on Chilean mining firms, Chile responded by occupying Bolivian port cities, igniting the war. Peru became entangled in the conflict due to a secret defense pact with Bolivia, igniting a regional contest over raw material trade and strategic dominance. The economic stakes were immense. Throughout the 19th century, nitrates were in high demand across Europe and North America, before synthetic chemicals replaced natural nitrates. Nitrate shipments fueled agricultural expansion while nourishing militarized nations. Control over this trade conferred wealth and influence, extending far beyond South America's borders. Though outnumbered by its adversaries, Chile had built a stronger economy and more sophisticated state apparatus, granting it an advantage when hostilities erupted. Santiago's leaders understood victory was not merely about national survival, but also about economic security tied to the desert's mineral riches. Chile's triumph hinged on its naval power. Unlike Peru and Bolivia, Chile invested heavily in steam-powered vessels and modern artillery. The decisive role of naval supremacy became evident in the early naval engagements of the war. The Battle of Iquique in 1879 stands as the most renowned confrontation. Chilean commander Arturo Prat led his fleet in a daring yet seemingly doomed assault on Peru's ironclad Huascar. Soon after, the Chilean fleet captured the Huascar, removing Peru's most powerful warship from the conflict and securing Chile's control over strategic coastal positions. This naval superiority allowed Chile to effortlessly mobilize troops and supplies. As the war shifted to land, Chilean forces traversed arid deserts and rugged mountains. As the conflict shifted inland, Chilean troops traversed arid deserts and rugged mountain terrain, where thirst and exhaustion proved as deadly as bullets on the battlefield. Yet, the forces tempered in Hurricanesia demonstrated iron discipline and exceptional combat prowess. Advancing northward, Chilean troops reached the gates of Lima by 1881. The capture of Peru's capital was a stunning feat. This victory demonstrated how a smaller nation could overcome a powerful neighbor through organizational strength and naval superiority. The war concluded with formal border negotiations. Chile gained territory from Peru and Bolivia, acquiring provinces rich in nitrate deposits that sustained the national treasury for decades. For Bolivia, the defeat proved especially devastating. The nation lost its entire coastline, becoming permanently landlocked. This outcome shaped its national identity, leaving a wound that remains excruciatingly painful over a century later. Peru suffered significant territorial losses and endured long minus-term economic repercussions. Conversely, Chile replenished its treasury through resource exploitation, cementing its status as a regional power by the turn of the century. The lingering effects of this war continue to ferment in Bolivia. The annual national commemoration of Maritime Day honors the lost coastline, while calling attention to Bolivia's maritime claims. For Chile, the memory of heroes like Arturo Prat and the fruits of victory became symbols of unity and aspiration during a period when the nation sought enduring strength. By the late 1882s, Chile's power equilibrium faced immense pressure. President José Manuel Balmaceda, elected in 1896, resolved to expand the executive branch's authority. Convinced that a strong presidency was essential for modernization, he launched an ambitious reform agenda. During his tenure, new railways penetrated the interior, schools proliferated, and public works projects aimed to connect the nation with modern infrastructure. Balmaceda envisioned Chile not merely as an exporter of raw materials. He aspired to forge an advanced republic guided by robust state leadership. However, these reforms encountered obstruction from a Congress long dominated by conservative elites. Wealthy landowners and privileged classes viewed Balmaceda's vision as a direct threat to their rule. The conflict centered primarily on the national budget. Balmaceda insisted fiscal control, particularly over the vast revenues from the northern provinces. Nitrate industry should reside with the executive branch. Congress, however, refused to relinquish its fiscal authority. Both sides accused each other of unconstitutionality, intensifying the standoff between the legislative and executive branches. Faced with repeated congressional vetoes, Balmaceda declared he would govern independently, bypassing Congress. This conflict, born of political dispute, eventually escalated into open confrontation, shaking the institutional order established since 1833. In January 1891, the situation erupted into full-scale civil war. The Navy, with its formidable fleet, declared allegiance to Congress, placing maritime control and global trade routes under legislative authority. Simultaneously, the army fractured. Some units remained loyal to Balmaceda, while others sided with his opponents, forcing provinces to choose sides. This struggle was not a swift rebellion but a protracted, bloody war. Crucial battles erupted across northern and central regions, with both sides mobilizing thousands of troops. Railways and telegraph lines became instruments of war, enabling troop movements, uncritical intelligence transmission at speeds unimaginable decades earlier. The decisive phase arrived in the latter half of 1891. In August, after months of stalemate, the congressional forces gained the upper hand. Olmesto's army suffered crushing defeats at the battles of Conque and Palquila. These losses precipitated the collapse of his government. Within weeks, congressional troops entered Santiago to proclaim victory, facing the dual pressures of arrest and disgrace. Pinochet took his own life on September 19, 1890, the very day his constitutional presidential term ended. This suicide became the most dramatic presidential demise in Chilean history, revealing how deeply political conflict had torn the nation apart. The post-war establishment was not a presidential system, but a parliamentary republic. Congress gained extensive powers at the expense of weakening the executive branch. Thereafter, Chilean presidents faced constrained authority, often reduced to symbolic heads of state, while real power rested with legislators and the wealthy elites backing them. Ordinary citizens maintained limited political participation, with property ownership and social class persistently determining access to representation. A minor, yet intriguing episode emerged during this conflict: the disposition of the national treasury to prevent congressional forces from seizing the treasury. Valmac had transferred most of the gold to the U.S. Embassy. Remarkably, the gold was returned intact after the war, a rare instance where such an act avoided international scandal. This became a peculiar symbol of that desperate yet extraordinary era. Following Valmac's bloody presidency, Chile entered what historians often term the parliamentary republic period. Despite its parliamentary label, this system bore little resemblance to the European model. Theoretically, Chile shifted power from the executive branch to Congress, weakening the presidency and preventing the president from imposing personal agendas. The president became an administrator rather than a leader, with a cabinet's survival contingent upon congressional support. In practice, stable governments were rare. Fragile party coalitions, lacking the strong party discipline seen in nations like Britain, often disintegrated after brief tenures. This earned Chile the reputation of political paralysis. Despite the system enduring for over 3 decades, behind the institutions, real power remained in the hands of a wealthy elite. Affluent landowners, merchants, and nitrate magnates controlled parliamentary seats, steering legislative outcomes. Elections proceeded as usual, but were meticulously manipulated. Property and literacy minus-based voting restrictions excluded the masses from the political process. The upper classes saw no need to alter this arrangement. It preserved their rule while maintaining the appearance of constitutional government. For ordinary Chileans, political influence remained out of reach. Local bosses, family dynasties, and networks of nepotism exerted far greater sway over election outcomes than democratic choice. Despite this, the economy flourished under the system. The nitrate boom provided Chile with a stable revenue stream, especially as European agriculture became heavily reliant on the mineral to boost yields. In the northern desert, new towns sprang up almost overnight around nitrate offices and ports. Coastal hubs like Valparaiso became trade gateways, while Santiago absorbed national funds from tariffs and export taxes. For decades, the nitrate industry almost single-handedly sustained Chile's economy. Yet prosperity bred dependency. Few leaders genuinely pursued industrial diversification. Wealth concentrated among elites who invested profits in estates and urban projects rather than broad social improvements. The stark contrast between economic prosperity and political exclusion fueled growing discontent among the working class. Miners in the nitrate fields endured hazardous working conditions, meager wages, and corporate control over housing and shops. Factory workers in expanding cities faced similar hardships. Farmers tied to large estates failed to benefit from modern reforms, as old hierarchies kept them bound to land-owned to lenders. By the early 20th century, these groups began organizing, often inspired by foreign labor movements, strikes, protests, and demands for rights grew more frequent, signaling the fragility of social order beneath Chile's parliamentary facade. The state's response often turned to violence. The bloodiest incident erupted in the port city of Iquique in 1907. Thousands of striking nitrate miners and their families gathered at the Santa Maria school, demanding higher wages and better conditions. The military surrounded the site and opened fire, killing hundreds in what became known as the Santa Maria School Massacre. This tragedy shocked witnesses and remains a stark warning of the ruling class's ruthless methods to maintain authority. For workers, it reinforced their belief that the political order was inherently unjust. Ironically, during this same period, Chile became one of Latin America's most literate nations. Schools proliferated, newspapers circulated widely, and knowledge and culture flourished. Yet literacy failed to translate into civic rights. Though most could read and debate, they remained silent at the ballot box. This disconnect defined society during the parliamentary republic era, an increasingly modern society trapped within an outdated political system, delaying genuine democratic progress. The new constitution enacted in 1925 reshaped Chile's political order. For over 3 decades, under the parliamentary republic, Congress dominated governance. This system was widely regarded as outdated and incapable of meeting the social demands arising from urban population growth. A new constitution restored the president's central role, granting the executive branch broad authority over legislation, the military, and national administration. This move ended congressional rule, aiming to inject strong leadership into a nation facing political turmoil and deep social divisions. The presidency was no longer a ceremonial role, but re-emerged as the central power in national life. The key figure in this transformation was Arturo Alessandri, known as the Lion of Tirapoca. He had already championed reforms during his earlier administration. Bolstered by the new constitution, Alessandri committed to modernizing Chile through measures addressing the needs of workers, the middle class, and the growing urban population. His agenda included establishing a labor guard, strengthening trade unions, and creating a social security system. Education gained renewed emphasis, with more schools emerging to serve a society where literacy rates rose yet inequalities persisted. Alexander's reforms reflected a growing national initiative in socio-economic affairs, no longer entrusting progress solely to landowners and private miners sector elites. Despite these reforms, stability did not materialize immediately. Military intervention in politics persisted, particularly during the 1920s and 1930s. Coup attempts and short-lived military governments repeatedly disrupted constitutional order. Occasional attempts by military leaders to impose their own policies revealed tensions between the nascent civilian democracy and the war-Ines hardened, highly respected armed forces. This turbulence underscored the fragility of the new constitutional order during its initial decade. Over time, however, civilian rule gradually stabilized, and the military receded into a secondary role, though its influence never entirely faded from Chilean politics. Economically, Chile began moving away from its dependence on nitrate exports, which had collapsed when artificial substitutes emerged in Europe. This crisis revealed the dangers of over-minus reliance on a single resource. Consequently, successive governments shifted focus toward industrialization and the state-led development model. State-owned enterprises were established, and tariff policies encouraged domestic production to replace imported goods. Agricultural modernization advanced alongside this transformation, but the industrial rise of cities like Santiago became the hallmark of change. Yet Chile remained vulnerable to global market fluctuations, particularly during the Great Depression. Despite industrialization efforts, unemployment and poverty spread rapidly. The political landscape also underwent profound changes. New forces entered the mainstream, notably the socialist and communist parties, which gained support from organized workers and the urban middle class. Their electoral presence and influence in labor disputes broke the monopoly of elite classes in Chilean politics. Workers, teachers, and low-income groups gained formal representation within the system for the first time, though progress was uneven and frequently obstructed by conservative forces. Social policies advanced steadily during this period. Labor laws ensured improved working hours and safety protections. Public education expanded to broader regions, and early welfare systems laid the groundwork for subsequent reform. The state positioned itself as an intermediary between capital and labor, reflecting a balanced strategy seeking social stability amid modernization. In 1929, the establishment of line as Aires Nacionals, Latin America's first state-owned airline, was little known yet profoundly significant. Operating with just aircraft on domestic routes at inception, it evolved into one of Latin America's largest carriers. LATAM Airlines, symbolizing Chile's commitment not only to domestic connectivity, but also to integrating into global trade and transportation networks. In 1970, Chile reached an unprecedented historical turning point. Salvador Allende, a seasoned socialist politician and physician, won the presidential election through the Popular Unity Coalition. His election held not only historical significance for Chile, but also represented a global breakthrough. No country had ever elected a Marxist president through open democratic elections before. Supporters celebrated this outcome as proof that social change could be achieved through the ballot box rather than violence. The Popular Unity Coalition, comprising socialists, communists, radicals, and other left-wing parties, took on the mission of reshaping Chile's future. Allende's vision was revolutionary. He firmly believed Chile could advance toward socialism while preserving its democratic institutions. The new government took decisive action from the outset. The copper industry, the backbone of Chile's economy, long controlled by American corporations, was nationalized. These newly state-owned enterprises generated direct revenue for the government, funding education, healthcare, and housing programs. Land reform accelerated. Large estates were divided, with land distributed to farmers historically controlled by landowners. Simultaneously, the government worked to expand workers' social benefits, raise wages, freeze certain prices, and increase access to basic goods. These reforms transformed daily life for countless Chileans. Supporters rejoiced that workers, miners, and the impoverished majority were finally no longer marginalized. Workers' committees emerged in factories. New cultural initiatives flourished in communities, bringing a sense of empowerment to previously neglected areas. Yet this surge was accompanied by sharp divisions. The upper-middle class widely resisted government measures. They witnessed property expropriation, corporate regulation, and the questioning of their privileges. Political opponents accused Allende of using socialism as a cover to steer Chile toward dictatorship. Opposition extended far beyond Chile's borders. The U.S. government viewed Allende's rise with deep apprehension, fearing a socialist victory in Latin America would set a precedent during the Cold War. Washington slashed aid, obstructed trade, and backed Chilean opposition groups. This pressure compounded an already fragile economy. By the early 1970s, shortages of basic goods had become a daily reality. Long lines formed outside stores, while inflation eroded wage increases. Strikes organized by truck drivers and business owners disrupted supply chains. This bold social experiment was ultimately overshadowed by scarcity and economic chaos. As conditions deteriorated, political conflict escalated into open rupture. Leftist street militias and right-wing paramilitary groups marched side by side, each accusing the other of plotting to overthrow the republic. Parliament continually challenged presidential authority, while the world watched to see if Chile could preserve its democratic framework under immense pressure. By 1973, explosive tension permeated the national atmosphere. Rumors of coups swelled, and trust between political factions had nearly collapsed. On September 11, 1973, the event reached a sudden climax. The Chilean military, led by General Augusto Pinochet, staged a coup to overthrow the Allende government. Fighter jets bombed La Moneda, the presidential palace in Santiago, while tanks patrolled the streets. Allende refused to yield, holding his final stand within the palace's gunfire echoed through its halls. By sunset, the president was dead, and the military junta seized control of the nation. Chile's brief yet intense experiment in democratic socialism ended, leaving behind a fractured society and a historical legacy that sparked global debate. After the smoke cleared in Santiago in September 1973, General Augusto Pinochet emerged as the central figure of the new military junta. Though initially part of a collective leadership, Pinochet swiftly outmaneuvered other commanders to establish himself as the sole head of state. The new regime immediately dissolved Congress, banned leftist parties, and imposed press censorship. The institutional framework that had defined Chilean democracy was frozen in its track, with the military becoming the ultimate authority. Tanks patrolled the streets, curfews silenced the night, and an atmosphere of fear replaced any open political discourse. The subsequent crackdown was systematic. Thousands of Chileans were arrested in the first few weeks, many vanishing without a trace. Stadiums and military barracks became detention centers. Torture, murder, and secret trials became tools for eliminating dissent. The most brutal detention sites, like the Grimaldi Villa, operated covertly under the notorious National Intelligence Directorate DINA. This agency was later renamed the National Intelligence Center CNI, specializing in surveillance and counter-insurgency operations. Victims were often taken away in broad daylight. Families were left with no answers. Over the following decades, tens of thousands fled into exile, forming Chilean diaspora communities abroad that carried the stories of repression to the world. Those who remained adjusted their daily lives under intense surveillance. Unions were dismantled, universities placed under military oversight, and any signs of organized opposition were crushed. New legislation granted the government emergency decrees, serving as a pretext for indefinitely suspending rights. The vibrant civil society that had flourished in previous decades was forced into silence. Yet even as citizens lived under constant surveillance, the regime advanced profound economic transformations that would define Chile for decades. Pinochet deployed a team of economists trained at the University of Chicago, often called the Chicago Boys. They advocated radical free miners market reforms aimed at dismantling state intervention in the economy. Large state miners-owned enterprises were privatized. Social services like pensions and education were gradually transferred to private institutions. Import tariffs were drastically reduced, and foreign investment was openly welcomed. The resulting new economic model stood in stark contrast to past protectionism. International financial institutions hailed Chile as Latin America's pioneer of openness. Yet the reforms imposed costs on different groups. Businesses and foreign investors profited from the open market, while Chile's working class faced new hardships. Initial adjustments saw soaring unemployment and widening wealth gap. Public spending cuts reduced aid for basic needs, forcing many families into hardship. Over time, Chile's economy accelerated and industries modernized. Yet prosperity did not reach all citizens. The divide between affluent elites and impoverished masses became the region's most stark social fracture. To secure long-term rule, Pinochet enacted a new constitution in 1980. This constitution extended military influence beyond his tenure. preserving political space for unelected officers while restricting civilian authority. Stringent continuity clauses made the military government impervious to challenge. Pinochet outed it as a framework for stability, yet it cemented authoritarian rule while offering only the illusion of reform. By the late 1980s, domestic and international pressures continued to mount. In 1988, Pinochet sought legitimacy through a national referendum, expecting voters to extend his term. The result stunned observers. A majority voted no. This simple answer rendered his extension plans and paved the way for Chile's return to democracy. The military regime's end was not a sudden collapse, but a carefully orchestrated transition. In the 1988 referendum, Chileans were asked whether they supported General Pinochet remaining in power for another 8 years. To the surprise of many both at home and abroad, a majority of voters cast their ballots against him. This single word marked the first serious crack in the dictatorship. The following years were spent negotiating the specific terms for a return to civilian government. By 1990, Patricio Aylwin was elected president, becoming the first democratically elected leader in nearly a decade. His administration both preserved traditions and drove change. Democratic institutions were restored, yet the constitution drafted under Pinochet remained in force, and the military retained significant influence. Subsequent governments were led by the Concertación coalition, a center-minus left alliance spanning factions from socialists to Christian immigrants. For 2 decades, they steered Chile's political course. Their core mission was reconciliation and stability. This meant avoiding radical change while rebuilding trust in democracy. They implemented welfare programs, invested in education, and strengthened civil society through gradual reforms. Their cautious approach reassured global investors and cemented Chile's image as one of the region's most stable democracies. Reconciling with history proved far more difficult. The Air administration established the Rettig Commission in 1991 to investigate human rights violations during the dictatorship. The report documented thousands of murders and disappearances. Subsequent Via Alegre commissions added records of torture and imprisonment. These reports granted official recognition to victims and their families long denied justice. Yet for many Chileans, the lack of trials or substantive punishment for perpetrators remains deeply frustrating. Amnesty laws and political deals left the military's core untouched, highlighting the limitations of accountability mechanisms during fragile transitions. Economically, Chile entered a period of rapid growth in the 1990s. Copper mining, the backbone of national exports, benefited from robust international demand. Free trade agreements opened new buyer channels, while market liberalization and fiscal discipline policies attracted foreign investment. As capital flowed into the country, poverty rates declined, the number of primary, secondary, and tertiary institutions surged, healthcare coverage expanded, and new infrastructure projects connected remote regions. These achievements significantly narrowed Chile's wealth gap compared to the dictatorship era. Although polarization was never fully eradicated, democratic governments remained constrained by specific limitations. Pinochet remained commander-in-minus chief of the army until 1998, a constant reminder of the regime's enduring influence. Even after retirement, he retained his lifetime Senate seat. His political presence ensured the transition never achieved a complete break. Civilian leaders respected this delicate equilibrium, knowing that forcing radical change could reopen the scars of conflict. In 2006, Chile witnessed another historic breakthrough. Michelle Bachelet, a socialist politician and former physician, became the nation's first female president. Her election held profound symbolic significance. Her father, an Air Force general, had been tortured to death during the dictatorship. This personal tragedy resonated with millions, revealing how history's shadows continue shaping the present even as democracy deepens. By the dawn of the 21st century, Chile had reached heights envied by its neighbors, boasting steady growth, low inflation, and political stability. It emerged as one of Latin America's strongest democracies. Copper still dominated exports, but emerging industries and global trade agreements diversified the economy, linking Chile to markets as far as Asia and Europe. International observers often hailed Chile as a model of economic governance in the region. Yet beneath this progress lies another reality. Income inequality remains among Latin America's worst, with stark disparities in access to public services like healthcare, pensions, and education. Many Chileans feel that while the nation is prosperous, its wealth is not shared equitably. The wave of student protests that erupted in 2011 became the first major signal of this discontent. High school and university students took to the streets demanding free, quality public education. For decades, Chile's education system has been shaped by privatization policies implemented during the dictatorship era, leaving families burdened with debt and students facing exorbitant tuition fees. The protests quickly transcended the confines of education reform. They exposed public resentment toward an existing system where opportunity and wealth are inextricably linked, rendering the promise of social mobility unattainable for the younger generation. Demonstrations persisted for months, with marches blocking city centers and rallies garnering widespread public support. In a society still divided by structural gaps, this generation raised a cry for equality. 8 years later, the wave of protests returned with a scale that shocked the nation and the world. In October 2019, a minor fare increase on Santiago's metro sparked passenger anger. Within days, the protests had transcended transportation issues. People from all walks of life joined the demonstrations, viewing the fare hike as a symbol of deep-rooted inequality in daily life. Millions nationwide took to the streets demanding reforms to pensions, wages, healthcare, and education systems. Clashes with police, curfews, and the declaration of a state of emergency signaled the government's gravity in addressing this challenge. Yet the movement's sheer scale granted it unparalleled power. Core demands emerge clearly. Abolish the 1980 constitution enacted by the Pinochet regime. For many, this constitution is the root cause of Chilean social inequality, restricting social reform and cementing a market-dominated model. Calls for a new constitution grew increasingly vocal, culminating in a 2020 referendum that overwhelmingly approved the proposal. In 2021, Chile held the world's first constitutional assembly elections. This assembly became the first of its kind to commit to gender equality and include indigenous representation. The process drew global attention for promising a progressive and inclusive framework for change. However, the 2022 draft proposal was rejected by voters, highlighting Chile's social divisions. The rejection did not end the process but reset the agenda, giving rise to a new proposal balancing reform and tradition. Amid ongoing constitutional debates, Chile is playing an increasingly vital role in global markets for another reason: lithium. Chile possesses some of the world's largest lithium reserves, concentrated in northern salt flats. With the rise of electric vehicles and renewable energy storage technologies, lithium has become a strategic resource, positioning Chile at the forefront of the transition to a green global economy. Amid the 2019 protests, a long-minus forgotten song resurfaced. Victor Jara's The Right to Live in Peace ballad banned after his 1973 assassination echoed once more across plazas and streets, sung by thousands. It became a bridge connecting generations, linking memories of dictatorship with Chile's contemporary struggle for dignity and justice. Thus this chapter of history gradually merged into the tranquil river of time. Some mysteries remain unsolved. Some truths continue to shape our world. Together we traverse the past, drawing lessons from its depths. If you weave this understanding into your daily life, History's echoes will never fade. Thank you for listening. Until we meet again, may the memories of days gone by remain forever in your heart.